Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWICS, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first of our 4 Pre-Modern Korea lectures this year at GWICS. And it's a great honor and pleasure to welcome Sixiang Wang of UCLA today as our speaker. For many of you, I'm sure he needs little introduction. He's an associate professor of Asian languages and cultures at UCLA, and his research extends in looking into the empire building and interactions in the pre-modern era, the history of science and knowledge. And his 2023 book, Boundless Winds of Empire, won the field's major prizes, the Pele Book Prize and the Hong Young Lee Book Award. Today's talk is extending some of that first book. All right, Sixiang, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Professor Arrington, for the generous introduction. I hope I can do it justice. So I hope everybody can see the slides. Before I begin, I should say that today's talk is really framed around my 2023 book, Boundless Winds, which argues for the importance of taking seriously Korea's use of ritual and rhetoric in its dealings with China's imperial rulers. But rather than give a rehash of the book's main ideas, I thought what I would do today is to try to think about how the book's approach, which really is a work of pre-modern history, might intervene into wider conversations about international relations, including Korea's place in the contemporary world. One of the animating questions in recent years is what to become of South Korea's special relationship with the United States amidst a changing global order, especially one that grapples with the rise, if not eventual dominance of China in the Asia-Pacific and its great power rivalry with the US. I'm not here to prognosticate the future, but I think it is fair to say that policymakers and diplomats in South Korea, US, and China take this issue very seriously, whatever their precise politics, aspirations, or judgments regarding the outcome. For the Republic of Korea, the question of how South Korea should position itself amidst wider great power rivalries is also one that evokes longer and deeper histories, and ones that come with quite a bit of traumatic historical memory at that. The Korean Peninsula on the cusp of the Cold War, which began with a cataclysmic hot war that left 2 to 3 million Koreans dead. The Joseon dynasty's struggle with East Asia's entry into the modern diplomatic system, and the navigation of rivalries between China, Japan, and Russia, which ended with Korea's colonization. Now, if we go further back, the Joseon dynasty during the Ming-Qing transition, and finally, the Goryeo dynasty's difficulties with the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. Each of these critical moments of great power shifts had devastating social, economic, and humanitarian consequences for Korea, even if these moments of crisis punctuated fairly long periods of peace and prosperity. And during these periods of crisis and peace, how to manage Korea's relationship with one or more great powers was an ever-present question. When the discussion comes to contemporary South Korean diplomacy, especially after democratization and globalization, an outstanding question is how its diplomatic strategy accounts for the alliance arrangement with the United States, and whether this alliance arrangement can be understood as part of a consistent South Korean grand strategy. The purpose of today's talk is not to give an answer to this question, but rather to use the pre-modern or early modern Korean experiences with great powers, in particular its diplomatic tactics and strategy, to think through this issue. In this respect, my work can be said to have adopted a new diplomatic history approach to the question. In contrast to traditional diplomatic history, which usually focuses on the overtly political aspects of interstate relations, the new diplomatic history is one that is more holistic, one whose analysis is interested in, quote, how social structures and cultural practices shape political interactions that are both multiple and flexible, focusing on things like gifts, architecture, and other forms of material culture, practices, rituals, and other ceremonial aspects, performativity, hospitality, and sociability, emotions, sensory aspects of diplomacy, and beyond. So rather than a play-by-play narrative back and forth that tracks the activities of formal diplomatic actors, a new diplomatic history is going to track more the infrastructural context, the practices, norms, and cultures of interaction that make diplomatic activity possible in the first place. So from this lens, I will try to show in today's talk that to think about the grand strategy of middle powers rather than great powers, one needs to account for this level of interaction. That is, interactions that are constitutive of the context of diplomacy, ones whose outcomes are about seeking and shaping that context, rather than necessarily achieving particular discrete ends. Although it is still often important, although that is still important, we have to look at how middling powers are also trying to shape the diplomatic infrastructure around them. And I contend that it is this arena where they have comparatively more agency, especially since middling powers do not have the coercive tools at their disposal to shape outcomes in other arenas. So for today's talk, I will begin with a discussion of the debate about whether middling powers or middle powers, such as Korea, can have a grand strategy. Then I will move on to point out how conventional discussions about grand strategy, regardless of how you fall on the first question, discounts the role of structural asymmetry in relationships between middle powers and their great power counterparts. I will then argue, in line with the new diplomatic history approach, that a big chunk of pre-modern Korea's grand strategy is about narrative manipulation. That is about shaping how the great power, whether it is the Mongols, the Ming, or the Manchus, understand themselves and their relationship with Korea. Two of the rhetorical tactics employed in this strategy I will talk more about in the talk are autoethnography and the imperializing mode. But I think what is interesting from this, and this is perhaps something I have not actually made explicit in the book, but it is a subject I have been pondering over, and it is the unintended second-order consequences of this narrative manipulation, especially in the longue durée. The thing with the rhetorical manipulation is that it meant integrating Korea into a larger imperial story. And I will argue that one result of this is something like a constitutionalization of the bilateral relationship. That is to say, it comes to resemble less a discrete bilateral relationship between two states, but something much more entangled and mutually informed, even as it retains its asymmetrical character. And I will conclude with some wider questions and thoughts, implications about what this might mean for understanding this history and also international relations today. So, can middling powers have grand strategy? Before moving on, we need to address the question of what we mean by grand strategy. It is a term used by historians and political scientists alike to describe how a political entity mobilizes its available resources, whether diplomatic, material, economic, cultural, or military, in service of coherent strategic objectives in a wider political arena beyond the bounds of its immediate political control. For this reason, grand strategy is often used to describe the planning and thinking of decision makers leading large powers, which in world history often means large, powerful empires with the wherewithal to influence affairs far from their zones of direct control. The Byzantines, the Chinese, the Spanish Empire under Philip II. And if these decision makers confront similar geopolitical challenges or invest in particular ideological visions that commit them to certain outcomes, for example, the leader of Orthodox Christendom, preserver of Confucian civilization, or the missionary zeal to convert the world to Catholicism, we might also talk about how the grand strategy persists in long durée terms and can transcend the usual internal divisions. That is, it remains in place despite changes in who's in power, what factions in power, even if their preferred means might vary. This is because the strategic environment remains fairly consistent. For example, in Chinese or Byzantine cases, the threat from nomadic coalitions remains a fairly constant challenge. What might vary from ruler to ruler is the choice to use tributary diplomacy, military coercion, or economic incentives, and in what proportion. But the strategic challenge remains the same. But what about middle powers such as Korea? Recently, for South Korean diplomacy over the last few decades, there has been a debate about whether grand strategy might apply for South Korea as well. For example, Professor Raman Pardo, which some of you might know, has argued that South Korean diplomacy since the 1990s has largely cleaved to a similar recognizable strategy despite regular turnover in the elected government. Holding back North Korea, relying on the alliance with the US, and expanding South Korea's economic and cultural links globally are fairly consistent of pillars, regardless of whether it's the left or the right in power. The balance of particular elements might vary, but the strategic aims are largely similar. Pardo calls this a grand strategy, but this has been critiqued in various circles, and I'll just want to flag one article. I mean, there are many replies to this, but this article from Foreign Policy, written by Jo Inge Bekkevoort, who is a former diplomat, I believe, has argued that South Korea cannot escape its geography, and if geography is destiny, the country it was dealt a weak hand. Located between three traditional great powers, China, Japan, and Russia, and a nuclear-armed North Korea on its border, South Korea finds itself in a more precarious position than most middle powers. In the neighborhood, South Korea's growing influence in regional and global politics would not suffice to control international outcomes and pursue a grand strategy outside of the US alliance. So the key sticking point conceptually is that South Korea cannot have a diplomatic grand strategy because grand strategy, in policy is that it's in the capacity of the nation's leaders to bring together all of the elements, both militarily and non-military, for the preservation and enhancement of the nation's long-term best interests. In other words, grand strategy is laid out for the long term and brings together all of a nation's resources to pursue a specific goal with clearly stated ways and means to get there. So interestingly, this critique says South Korea fulfills all these requirements, but the sticking point is whether or not South Korea's reliance on one alliance with one great power disqualifies it from that definition. So if the point of grand strategy is that a state pursuing a grand strategy must have the power to define the end goal, and in a large measure shape and control the ways and means identified to reach it, we might conclude that South Korea falls short. In other words, the South Korea-US alliance might be an element in US grand strategy, but not vice versa. I think there are many ways to think about this observation. I'm not a scholar of contemporary international relations, nor am I a defense specialist or someone with actual diplomatic or military experience. So I will leave some of these considerations aside in favor of a historical one. If a critical issue is who defines the end goal, an empirical archival question might be one might ask of the US-Korea alliance is one that is perhaps very difficult to determine in short order, but the question would be who made South Korea's preservation and integration into a US-led world order a priority in the first place? And once it is made a priority, who is doing the work to ensure that this continues to be the case? Was it US policymakers or was it someone else? So let me just stop at this image for a second. The image here is suggestive of a certain kind of asymmetrical dynamics between a great power and its, quote, junior partner. We might think of this as the tail wagging the dog, or at the very least, a kind of interest capture, whereby the weaker party in a close bilateral relationship does what it can to ensure its diplomatic priorities also becomes the priorities of the stronger party. From the analytical perspective of structural asymmetry, we might state that since the alliance is of existential consequence for South Korea in ways that it is not for the US, we might suggest that South Korea will always pay more attention to the US than vice versa. South Korea is strongly incentivized to make sure the US deals with itself in a specific way. This may or may not entail making sure the US pays more attention to South Korean priorities. As we'll see, attention can be a double-edged sword. But regardless, what matters is, given the incentives and power dynamics, it is more likely to be the weaker party in such relationships that bear the burden of managing and maintaining the relationship. Given this observation, I think we can make a case to see this as part of, if not a Korean grand strategy, at least a middling power strategy. Granted, if we go with grand strategy, it may mean provisionally adjusting the classical definition, but I hope the audience will bear in mind that I'm not interested in defining or altering how that word is used by the field or by strategic planners outside of the context of this talk. This is a historical exercise, an effort to illuminate aspects about Korean diplomacy in the past. So with that, let me turn to the main area of my research, early modern Korea, or Korea during the Chosun period. Whether or not we afford the label grand strategy to the behaviors and dispositions of the Kingdom of Chosun, or any other middling power for that matter, it remains the fact that the rulers of Chosun Korea did have a sense of strategy, and one that they aligned the resources they did have control over in service of that strategy. One problem is we often miss the strategy because rhetorically it is often spoken of in normative terms. I think this has more to do with the political culture and discursive environment of the period than anything substantive about the presence or absence of strategic thinking. As it is well known, Chosun Korea, basically as soon as it was established, adopted a consistently conciliatory and accommodating policy to Ming China. This is captured in the slogan, serving the great, or Sade. The larger context of this was the Goryeo dynasty, which ruled Korea from 918 to 1392, had been a client state of the Mongol Empire. However, the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Ming Empire in China placed Goryeo rulers in a diplomatic dilemma, whether to honor the close familial and political ties it had with the Mongols or to side with the rising Ming. The dilemma also destabilized the royal house, leading to a number of coups d'etats and even royal assassinations. In 1388, tensions with the Ming court mounted after Ming forces took over southern Manchuria and announced that the intention to establish a frontier garrison at Tailing Pass, which is here. Oh, okay, right here. The Goryeo court sent diplomats to the Ming court to plead against the move, while it prepared a military expedition to attack Ming-controlled Manchuria. The army crossed the Yalu River in the 5th month of 1388, but found it swelling from heavy rains. As the army stalled on the island of Weihua, one of the generals leading the expedition mutinied, tied up the commanders, and returned to the capital. This fateful return to Weihua Island was led by the Goryeo general Yi Seong-gae, who, upon his return to Korea, established himself as, purged his political opponents and deposed the Korean king, and eventually established himself as the first ruler of the Joseon dynasty. His reluctance to lead the army against the Ming has been explained both by himself and later historians as ideological. He was supposedly committed to an ideology of Sade, where it was only right for the ruler of Korea to obey the emperor. He once said that for the small to go against the great is the first mistake. He also told his troops that if we violate the territory of the superior country, the Ming, we will be blamed by the son of heaven, and great will be the calamity to befall our dynastic shrines, state altars, and common people. But before we take this as saying something about Lee Seong-gae's inherently pro-Ming tendencies, we should be reminded that this decision by Lee Seong-gae was very much motivated by realpolitik. And even after taking the throne, the Ming court refused to recognize him as Korea's legitimate rulers, and even threatened him with a military invasion. When his officials asked him what he would do regarding the Ming emperor's saber rattling, he stated, "The emperor acquired his realm only because of his vast armies and severe policies. He killed excessively so that even his meritorious ministers and chief advisors could not save themselves. He also scrutinizes our small country over and over, making endless and outrageous demands. Now he also accuses me of contrived crimes and threatens me with his troops. How is this any different from trying to scare a child by screaming? I can only serve him carefully with humble words." Lee Seong-gae's statements, in quite a pithy way, describe the overall strategic situation and the concrete constraints his new regime faced in deciding his diplomatic approach. We can dispense with any idea that Lee Seong-gae believed seeking to become a Ming vassal had anything to do with the love of China, and this was a decision based on a realist calculation. But I do want to point out that he also believed that careful diplomacy was going to be the only way out. I won't get into how the Joseon-Ming relationship eventually improved. That's a whole other discussion. But if we skip to the reign of Lee Seong-gae's son, King Taejong, we see a different geopolitical scenario unfold, although palpable continuities remain. At the time, Ming was at the height of its power and able to fight wars on multiple theaters. When the news of the emperor's invasion of Vietnam in 1407 reached Korea, the Joseon court surmised that a small country like Vietnam could not have stood a chance against the entire might of the Ming Empire. The court worried that one day Ming might do the same to Korea and urged the king to order the construction of forts and the stockpiling of grain. The emperor, who loved vainglory and relished triumph, could use any pretext to launch an invasion. But the Joseon king believed that as long as Joseon could satisfy the emperor's pride, they could avoid the fate of the Vietnamese. A few years later, in 1413, Ming armies marched on Mongolia, and the Joseon court received intelligence of dubious reliability that the emperor was going to construct 3,000 warships to launch a seaborne invasion of Japan. Some Korean court officials believed that it was only a matter of time before the Ming would target Korea. The king was unconvinced and believed that the emperor would not do so. But his officials reminded him that in the past, emperors dangled false promises to rivals before picking them off one by one. He begged the king to fortify the capital city and forge a defensive alliance with Japan. The king, however, explained that the emperor had attacked Vietnam to the south and the wastelands of the north. Given the overextension, he didn't think the Ming emperor would attack Korea. And he also said if a Ming army really came to Korea, he would have to accept that, quote, all things were due their rise and fall. He would simply meet the emperor in the field and see what happens. Waiting behind his walls would be useless. For King Taejong, preventing such threats from materializing was far better than trying to gamble on the battlefield. For him, diplomacy, and in particular, leaning on his status as the Ming emperor's vassal was a much better course of action. To be sure, Taejong did not himself have any illusions about Ming morality or its good intentions. For him, it was a judgment call based on an assessment of the strategic situation. He also had to overrule his own advisors. And in other words, I would say that diplomacy here was a choice. I don't think we'll have time to talk about the 1481 example, but I think what I'll skip to is just this diagram here. In retrospect, it might be easy for us to dismiss Korean anxiety about Ming aggression because this threat never materialized historically. We have the benefit of hindsight, but we cannot know if Joseon had adapted a different, maybe more aggressive approach, or if the Ming actually had been more successful in Mongolia, whether a Ming war of conquest might not have manifested in Korea. There's no way to know. What remains clear, however, is that the idea that the rulers of China might present an existential threat remained implicitly on the table, even if it faded over time. So this is where Brantley Walmart and Jian Li's work on asymmetry in China's imperial relations with its neighbors is illustrative. So we'll take a look at the diagram, where basically bilateral ties characterized by extreme asymmetries of power present different risks and stakes for each party. The weaker party, B, poses no existential threat to its counterpart, A, but the latter could inflict great harm on, if not destroy, the former. While with any misstep potentially disastrous, Chosun had an incentive to scrutinize Ming's every move before deciding on a course of action. On the other hand, because Chosun was one of many entities along Ming's vast frontier, Korean matters seldom received Ming's undivided attention. Therefore, Ming policies towards Chosun were more likely to be uncoordinated, with different arms of the Ming state acting on their own, even pursuing contradictory policies. Left unchecked, this combination of over-attention and inattention could be deadly. When Ming sent ambiguous, conflicting signals that were interpreted in Chosun through the lens of heightened attention, even minor points of tension could snowball into wider confrontations. So for a middle power, managing this is critical. And if we consider asymmetry, it becomes clear that if we use a great power-centered view of interstate relations, we might forget that middling powers have a very different kind of strategic objective and needs. And in this asymmetrical environment, the same tools that might be available to a great power, for example, military coercion or economic sanctions, are likely to have very little effect and, in fact, are more likely to backfire. So, for example, the Ming invaded the Mongolian steppe, and when it failed, it engaged in massive mobilization of corvée labor to prepare defensive works, now known as the Great Wall. To manage the relations with Japanese, Jurchens, and Tibetans, it selectively opened frontier markets to favorable groups, but when beset with security challenges, it can close off China to trade. Whether or not these tactics work to Ming's advantage is beside the point, but they all presume at least military parity and resource advantages. Chosun Korea can adopt similar approaches to Jurchen raiders and Japanese pirates, but they were not effective tools for managing their largest potential threat, Ming China. So whether or not we afford grand strategy to Chosun Korea on this count, we still need to appreciate that even identifying strategy, whether grand, middling, or petty, requires looking for different kinds of tools. In my recent book, Boundless Winds of Empire, I pointed to how ritual and rhetoric serves as arenas where such tools can can be used. What perhaps remains unanswered in the book is a theory of how ritual and rhetoric can actually have a strategic effect. And that is to say, if they are strategic considerations, there must be some mechanism for how they operate. And the book is not about grand strategy or strategy per se, and it identifies only a couple of threads. But I think one thing that I need to repeat over and over is that the point of a strategy is not that it always works. If it always works, it's not a strategy. It's just something you do all the time. But it's a theory of success, an idea of how things could work if conditions are met. Right. So I'll mention two approaches that I think are constitutive of Korea's strategy. And these tactics are autoethnography and the imperializing mode. So autoethnography, I think I won't read this whole quote, essentially is a way where these subordinate groups take on and engage with those more powerful on the terms of the more powerful, right? And so even though the work comes from post-colonial studies, I think a lot of this applies to the Chosun case because Korean envoys also collaborated with imperial objectives while appropriating the imperial idioms and identified them as their own. And this often entailed buying into the essentialism that the empire had for its peripheral peoples, right? But without doing so, they wouldn't be able to engage with the empire on its terms. So this was critical for advancing the agendas of the Chosun court and its elites. The second mode is the imperializing mode. It's a little different, but it works alongside with autoethnography. So the imperializing rhetorical mode brought the normative elements of the imperial tradition to the negotiation table. It exhorted imperial agents to behave according to their professed values. Both autoethnography and the imperializing mode required the selective and judicious deployment of the empire's own narratives to cajole, entice, and ultimately persuade an emperor or his official to a course of action beneficial to the supplicant. The latter, hardly a technique exclusive to Korean envoys, was a tried and true tactic for anyone who found themselves in a difficult position to instruct monarchs. I think what's important here in the Chosun case is that this imperializing mode didn't just work on the emperors, but it worked on all sorts of people who were part of the imperial structure. Okay, so I'll give one example here, and this concerns a Korean envoy mission led by Namgon in 1519. So in 1509, the Ming Dynasty compiled the Ming Huidian, a massive administrative handbook that synthesizes all the regulations and procedures in the Ming court. As an official imperial publication, however, it included a quotation from the first Ming emperor, the dynasty's founder, that claimed Isongye, the founder of Joseon, had murdered 4 of Goryeo kings and usurped the throne. It also said Isongye was the son of an evil Goryeo official named Lee Ying-im. So knowledge that the Ming court included such derogatory statements about Joseon's founders caused real consternation at the Joseon court. For one, the statements, though inaccurate, were not completely untrue. Isongye was not the king of son of Im, but he did actually murder Goryeo kings. Just 3 of them, not all 4. And it was also true that he was a usurper. So Namdon's mission in 1519 was to protest these lines in the Ming court's official documents and seek for them to be excised and removed. The appeal was not successful, but I bring this up to illustrate how Namgon and the Joseon court approached the problem. These facts were suppressed within Joseon, but the problem was that these were the sacred words of the Ming emperor and could provide a rhetorical anchor for all sorts of political difficulties. And the problem is, how do you explain to the Ming that the emperor was wrong without saying that he was wrong? And this was not something that could be proven or disproven with facts that matter. So what Namgon relied on was sophistry. It's a long appeal, so I'll quote from here and there. So he says, "We, the state of Joseon, are by the edge of the sea. Though we are far away and humble, we have communicated with the central state for generations and are well versed in the teachings of poetry, writing, propriety, and righteousness. We rectified names and value moral relations." So this is the autoethnography, speaking to the empire as the empire wishes to see you. "It has been a long time since we have used Chinese ways to transform barbarian ways. Now the time of the Sagely dynasty, the eastward transmission of civilization has reached us first. But as for assassination and rebellion, these are all the greatest evils in the world. No man can tolerate them. No law can forgive them. As for how my country's founding ancestors treated the Wang house, all its details are clear in my petitions. They did not even menace them with a hairbreadth force. But yet they have now suffered this evil reputation. It turns Korea into a lair of rebels. Korea's state of civilization and loyal service to the Ming that it was inconceivable for the dynasty to be founded in sin. As a civilized Confucian country that followed the Ming's example, it was impossible for its founder, Isongye, to have done any wrong. This was an argument from an a priori that Joseon was by definition incapable of guilt." So there is a kind of a circular logic here that we can try to follow, because the point here is that assassination and rebellion were slanderous. Therefore, the damage it caused Joseon's moral reputation resulted in a grievance that compelled the just sovereign to alleviate. The Ming, as Joseon's overlord, was obligated to intercede on Joseon's behalf. If Ming did not intercede, it would be failing in its obligations as the empire. So Namgon continues. He asks, "What would become of all that we have learned from the central state? The poetry, the writing, the propriety, the righteousness, the moral relations, and the rectified names. Those in the future who read these lines would all certainly say Joseon is a country of assassins and rebels. They would also say, could it be that a country of assassins and rebels were among the countries that paid tribute to Ming?" So Namgon had transformed a controversy over Korea's reputation into one about the present prestige and future historical legacy of the Ming Empire. With this line of reasoning, of questioning, it hit the crux of the matter as a diplomatic issue. Korea's portrayal was not one of moral accountability or historical truth, but of representation, reputation, and political correctness. If the situation were not corrected, neither Joseon nor Ming could escape the searing judgment of later generations. So Ming, by nurturing this small country, would have supported this immoral regime. And as long as the two courts were bound together through a communion of tributary ritual, an immoral vassal could only mean an immoral empire. If the indignation of slander suffered by one, it would lead to the infamy of the other. Only by insisting that Joseon was pristine could Ming remain immaculate. As I said before, Namgon's mission was not successful immediately, but I should add that from the 1500s to 1589, the Joseon dynasty basically sent missions to Beijing reiterating these points almost every year. So when in 1589, when a new edition of the Ming Huidian was published, the offending words were finally stricken from the record. So in a sense, this narrative manipulation achieved through a combination of autoethnographic and imperializing modes did work, but its effect takes place over the long term. It's about shaping the wider discursive landscape, establishing precedents, and relying on routines. But if you've noticed, in Namgun's rhetoric, something else is being created in the process, and this is a second-order consequence of what I tentatively call constitutionalization. Namgun's rhetoric implied that Ming and Joseon were not separate entities, but mutually constitutive and shared a special reciprocity in the same moral order. The choices here have an impact beyond the immediate moment, but shape the institutional and discursive environment of diplomacy. Indeed, Namgun's appeal made the long game clear and relied on a longue durée historical sensibility. It imagined a day when the Ming and Joseon were long gone, yet the precedents they had built will still matter. It assumes that this relationship will go on forever. When we read Namgun's appeal in its context, it's easy to see this rhetoric as merely expedient, the right words for the right moment to achieve certain ends. However, what happens when the same words are repeated again and again over a period of decades, even centuries? This expediency, I think, comes at a cost. Or rather, if we speak about this more neutrally, it is the second-order effect of constitutionalization. At least for the Joseon period, it is a sense, even within Korea, that Joseon's political order depended on a certain alignment with the empire, even if that relationship is formally outside of its constitutional order. This also affects the empire as well, where Joseon's relationship is not simply bilateral, but is tightly woven into its own structures, even if its domestic consequences are not readily apparent. So this can be a bit abstract, but if we think about this through contemporary parallels, if South Korea were to abandon the US alliance, either willingly or because another great power supplants it, it would certainly be devastating to the US position in the Pacific, but I doubt it would amount to a full-blown constitutional crisis here in the US. It will, however, upend a lot of US Asia-Pacific policy and probably affect US alliance structures elsewhere. But at the same time, South Korea and the American public's reaction to the arbitrary arrest of Korean engineers at the Hyundai plant is also suggestive. How the US deals with South Korea can touch on issues of constitutional concern here as well. But the rule of asymmetry still holds. Given South Korea's cultural ideological commitments to representative democracy, something that is really bipartisan in Korea today, it would be much more devastating to South Korea if it had to switch great power allegiances, precisely because it wouldn't just be a question of diplomatic alignment. It would raise fundamental constitutional questions for Korea's body politic. Indeed, we can see this process at work if we think about Joseon Korea's political difficulties in finding a new way to legitimize the kingship after the fall of the Ming dynasty and the efforts the Manchu Qing Empire made to integrate Joseon Korea into its ideology of empire. So I had another example, which I think maybe in the interest of time, I'll just move on towards the conclusion. I've been talking for about 35 minutes, but I think just in summary, what this example was, in a way, I think it parallels the experience of the Korean engineers. And this is a case where Joseon diplomats felt that they were unfairly treated during an imperial ritual. It used to be the case that when they would line up for an imperial ritual, Koreans would line up in the front, right behind Ming officials. But because they forgot to bribe someone or somebody was upset at the Korean entourage, they were demoted and forced to stand behind Ming commoners. And this led to a huge protest. Well, I wouldn't say huge, but because we don't know much about it besides these documents, but a forceful protest by the Korean diplomat Park Sin-im, where he basically argues to the Ming that you cannot just arbitrarily change the rules of diplomacy. We have to follow the protocol. If you're going to change the rule, and I think I'll just read from his petition, is just this one line here, if I can find it. Oops. He's okay. It's not here, but he basically says that the problem is that there was an arbitrary change, an unfair change in imperial policy that was not properly communicated to us. He says, howsoever the superior state receives its vassals and subjects involves compromises and alterations. It was unheard of for vassals who came to their king's court to be degraded and humiliated by being placed behind the dregs of the base. Those in charge of court rituals should always observe the old precedents with resolve like the hardness of metal and stone. If it had been a matter that fomented corruption or interfered with government or harmed the interests of the state, then they should have memorialized the matter. Then it would have been needed to have been delegated to the relevant ministries, who could debate and decide on a policy to be proposed for imperial approval. Then it could be promulgated, informing all so that there would be no confusion or surprise. If things had been decided this way, then it would have been in accordance with propriety, and we men of afar, Koreans, would have nothing more to say of it. So he basically laid down to the Ming official what proper government procedure should look like. He then described what he saw to be a mockery of what we might now call due process. So he says the Ming officials acted in caprice. The imperial court knows nothing of the matter. The relevant ministry does not debate the matter. There is neither half a line of documentation nor a single explanation offered. We were forced by the ceremonial officials with tongues failing and arms waving. They destroyed the old rules long decided by previous reigns and changed the harmless existing law in a spur of a moment. So basically, he argues that Ming bureaucratic procedure should be held accountable to Chosun because its rulers have fulfilled all its obligations. He reminded the Ming official that a good ruler observes the rules that he sets himself. And I think these articulations come pretty close to an explicit articulation of what I mean by this constitution, if you will. It's an essay of how an imperial court should treat its loyal vassal and what the terms of that relationship should be. I think it is remarkable for me that here is not, what's remarkable here is not whether or not Pak was successful in making his case, but how it was now a Korean envoy, a visitor to Beijing who was now browbeating and lecturing Ming officials about how to run a proper empire, how to behave as the empire should. In other words, Pak Sin-yin was speaking not as a visitor, but a stakeholder. This and other examples, I think, point to something that lies beyond, both in the sense that it precedes the current political relationship and extends far into the future. The bilateral relationship anchored a larger moral political order, one that has a basis in the past, determinative of the present, and influences the future. So why do I think of this as constitutional? We all know that formal constitutions didn't exist in East Asia until the 19th century after the arrival of Western legal norms. But I think if we think comparatively, the ideas of the Korean constitutional law scholar Chae Kam has, which he expressed in his 2009 article that explores Confucian legitimacy through a comparative legal lens, is instructive. He says the notion of referring back to ancestral codes and ancient rituals may call into mind the Roman concept of mos maiorum, literally the ways of our ancestors, an idea which acted, among other things, as constitutional constraint on the government of the Roman Republic. He also says, constitutional discourse relies on a sense of continuity with the past, and although tradition per se may have lost much of its normative function, it still plays a significant role in constitutionalism past and present, and he's not speaking just about Korea, but about, or East Asia, but about constitutionalism in general. So I think what is critical for us in this discussion today is this continuity with the past, and that the sense that these norms come from somewhere and should continue to matter. And I think one of the most important outcomes of Chosun's diplomatic strategy, grand, middling, whatever, is, if you will, it ensconces this idea in the bilateral relationship. That is, it ensconces constitutionality in the bilateral relationship. And I think here it might be useful to contrast what I mean by bilateral versus constitutional. And this is not a hard and fast either or, but maybe we can think of this as a continuum. Bilaterality points to the language of treaties and contracts. It implies enough parity that both entities are able to enter a voluntary agreement with one another. You both have to be legal entities under the same regime. It's often localized. If you have an agreement with someone, it does not impinge on my agreement with someone else. It also implies some ontological equivalence. We're dealing with two sovereign states or two legal subjects. Whereas in the constitutional framing, we involve the language of covenants, of obligations that cannot just be broken unilaterally because one is always part of the whole. Often the entities involved are hierarchically differentiated. It could be a difference of high and low, or just simply that they're very different, distinct roles for each party to play. The relationship is ongoing, has a past and a present, and requires mutual recognition of a shared future or a basis for a shared future. So what does this mean? I won't have time to get into this in detail in the space of the talk, but I do think this process of constitutionalization continues through into the 17th and 19th centuries for Chosun's relationship with the Qing, although there are many caveats to this. And although I think the Chosun grand strategy of stabilizing its relations with the great power was fairly effective, it did mean that this repeated use of autoethnographic and imperializing modes led to a second order effect where in this constitutionalization, Korea gets tightly bound up with the empire, and it comes at a cost of and that cost is that it creates the normative conditions for Korean kingship's loss of political autonomy. In 1894, in the wake of the Sino-Japanese War, Chosun Korea, in some sense, won its independence from Qing China, but only to be flung into the throes of another great power conflict between a raising Japan and an ambitious Russian Empire. So these images may be familiar to everybody who knows something about Korean history. The one on the left is Yangwon-mun, the gate for welcoming Chinese emissaries outside of Seoul, which was torn down in 1894 and eventually replaced with Dongryungmun, which is Independence Gate to symbolize Korea's independence from Qing China. But even though I think 1895 marks a sharp end to the Sino-Korean constitutional bilateral relationship, however you want to define it, on a structural level, Korea's strategic dilemmas with great powers remain pertinent. But I think so does its long history with China and the residues of that imperial memory, which sometimes I think of it like an international relations version of a Jungian shadow that is often unmarked and unspoken, but nevertheless drives, I think, a lot of the emotional energy behind diplomacy in Northeast Asia today. By that, I mean there is the formal presentation of diplomatic positions, but then there is the repressed inner shadow, the thing that triggers us and bothers us when we see it in others. And it often does pop up in contemporary modern diplomacy. So this was an incident from the first Trump administration. President Trump and President Xi had a nice dinner. And President Trump comes out and says, I learned a lot from President Xi Jinping. He learned apparently that Korea used to be a part of China. And of course, this was very bad diplomatically. And, because a statement like this runs completely counter to the official diplomatic narratives of not just China, but also South Korea, China and South Korea's relationship, but also China and North Korea's official position with each other. So this stirred a bit of controversy and earned its share of protests and articulations and statements and whatnot. But I want to suggest that behind these tensions, right, behind many of the tensions between South Korea and China, is this anxiety about what China really thinks about South Korea or Korea in general beyond the official diplomatic narrative. There remains in China a vague sense of a lingering loss that China had lost an integral part of itself when Korea became a nation state. Indeed, it wasn't until nearly the end of World War II that, for example, and I have to thank Kirk Larson, who's in the audience for this tidbit, that Chiang Kai-shek officially relinquished Chinese claims over the Korean Peninsula as lost territory. So about 10 years ago, when China and South Korea had fairly warm diplomatic ties, there was quite a bit of coverage concerning Park Geun-hye's first state visit, which was to China. And this broke with U.S.-South Korea precedent because the South Korean president usually visits the U.S. as its first state visit. And a lot of the coverage in China was quite fawning, if I may say so. If you read the Chinese headline here, it says, Park Geun-hye has unbreakable ties or karmic links with China. She then proceeded to deliver a speech in Tsinghua University where she spoke Chinese, used Chinese idioms, and referenced her love of the Chinese classics, especially Romance of the Three Kingdoms. There's no way to find this now, but I remember a newscaster saying, quote, "We do not care how good her accent is, only the sincerity of her heart." The ebullience was about Korea finally coming back to China's fold. But of course, only a year later, the Park administration signed the THAAD missile agreement with the United States. And with that, the candle that had been rekindled was snuffed out. China behaved in the aftermath like a scorned suitor and overreacted in ways that I think really ran counter to its strategic interests. There was a soft, unspoken ban on K-pop imports, opening the gate to anti-Korean populism on the Chinese internet, and among other things, actions that really drove South Korean public opinion on China, which used to be quite positive, straight to the ground. And we're still dealing with that legacy, right? The effects of that. And on some level, I do not think this overreaction can be explained by the usual paradigms about bilateral relationships or great power rivalry or realism. There was something else at stake. And I think it's the shadow of this early modern world, the memory of a rosy Chinese imperial past that could not be fulfilled, a dream rather that could not be fulfilled. And I think this also explains why South Korea is so triggering for the Chinese internet in particular. I'm not going to go over this, but if you look for it, there's so much anti-Korean content in ways that feel quite disproportionate, right? There's this stuff about kimchi, there's stuff about the holidays, stuff about, just repeated ad nauseum, the idea that Koreans are stealing Chinese culture. The subtext here, of course, is that Korea does not have its own authentic culture, and everything is illegitimate about Korean culture. And I think part of it is just that if you think about autoethnography and the imperializing mode, the very tactics used effectively by Joseon diplomats for centuries, they were repeating the idea, actually, that Korea had no cultural agency of its own. In the shared diplomatic discourse, Korea owed all their cultural development to Chinese munificence, right? This was the official line from Joseon. But in this framing, it means a priori, Korea doesn't create its own culture. right, in this early modern framework. And I think it's been so deeply internalized, I think in Chinese vernacular culture, that when Korea now in the 20th century is 21st century is generating globally charismatic cultural products that may have some connection with the traditional East Asian Chinese, even Sinitic culture, that it becomes downright infuriating on a visceral level. Um, that is not explainable by geopolitics or something like wartime memories, right? Which usually explains China-Japan tensions, right? Sure, there was the Korean War, but Korea never invaded China in the 20th century that would have, in a way that would have left lingering antipathy, the kind of antipathy that would have been ready tinder for a nationalist conflagration. But yet here we are. There's something deeply difficult to untangle, but I will suggest, at least for today, that it has something to do with the legacies of an early modern world where Korea and China shared a larger constitutional order. And the irony, of course, was that this had been a cornerstone of Chosun Korea's diplomatic strategy, but now in the 21st century, its residues still linger in quite uncomfortable ways, I think. I think I'll just leave with this slide. I'm not going to read this, but these are kind of like, the Cliff Notes versions of my talk. If you are just like, wait, but what did this all mean? So these are maybe, if I were to reduce what I was going to say in aphoristic form, this is what I would say. But yeah, I think I'll just stop here and let the audience, maybe answer some questions or.
Thank you very much, Sixiang. As a scholar of contemporary Korea, this is a fascinating link back and forth across time. And I spent a lot of time earlier this week with some Korean colleagues thinking about how do Korean government officials formulate strategy given the uncertainties of the Trump administration. So this is very relevant and timely in many ways. I wanted to remind the audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, please. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, if I could start off with one question. So it seems like, again, coming from somebody who studies contemporary Korea, some of the ways in which your narrative manipulation strategies work depend on the shared understanding from Confucian ideas that the ruler has an obligation to rule justly, and it leverages that. So part of my question was in a context where we don't have that. I don't say in the contemporary era, President Trump does not have this mandate from heaven, if you will. Do these types of strategies still work, or and do you see differences across the Ming and the Qing dynasty in terms of the amount to which the degree to which Confucianism matters?
So I think Confucianism absolutely does matter, and it does for how to talk with empire and whatnot. But I think one thing I should just remind everybody is that Koreans did not take their inclusion in the Confucian ecumene for granted, right? Because in order to activate that script, your counterparts in Imperial China have to actually believe that you're actually Confucian, and don't just reject you as strange barbarians cosplaying, right? And that's often how the Ming elite saw Chosun envoys, right? That they were dressing like us and buying books, but they actually were not civilized, right? So you have to first use the autoethnography to present yourself as we are actually Confucian. We are eligible, so please listen to us, right? So you have to earn that place at the table first for the rest of the strategy to work, right? And I think this can vary, right? Depending on the moment in history and time, there may be more buy-in with this Confucian idea, right? And for example, during the Mongol period, this Confucian idea works really well with the Confucian officials working for the Mongol court, the Khitan, Jurchen, and Han officials who worked for Kublai Khan. But Kublai Khan didn't really care. So with Kublai Khan, you need a different repertoire, right? And that's where the Koryo court is engaging with Mongol ideas of rulership, the marriage alliance, things that speak at that level, right? So what that is can change over time. But for example, the Chosun, the Koryo kings shave their heads in the Mongol style, and that's very non-Confucian, right? You're not supposed to change your haircut like that. But this shows to Kublai Khan that we want to be like Mongols, right? And then meanwhile, your officials can still exchange poetry with Confucian officials at the Mongol court. And we think about the 21st century or 20th century, Korean adoption. For example, Lee Sun-man was not a democratic person, yet he cosplayed democracy. Park Geun-hye was not very democratic, but he still was constrained by the idea that he needs to present South Korea as a democracy in order for the United States to respond to it, right? So I think that's important. And I think the interesting thing about this cosplaying, if you will, is that it eventually becomes real. If you fake it until you make it, we do this as academics, but it also works, I think, internationally. If you pretend to have the trappings of democracy, eventually these institutions may actually turn you into a democracy. And whether or not, this was desired by the people who implemented them in the first place. So I do think, the current issues with the United States does present some challenges, but I did share that screen where South Korea gave the president a royal crown. It's maybe the signaling from the White House is what I would like to say is an early modern imperial mode. The style of the new ballroom is reminiscent of the Winter Palace. And so I think like there is a different idiom of rulership that the current presidency is engaged in. And I think South Korea, from what I can tell, is willing and able to interface with that idiom, right? That doesn't mean, from what I can tell, it's not like South Korea is going to abandon democracy all of a sudden. I mean, that's not the case because this is happening on multiple levels, right? As far as I can tell, the United States, we do have people in charge that are leaning into this early modern imperial idiom, even though we're supposed to be a post-Enlightenment democratic republic. But these idioms are both in play, right? However we think, and I think from South Korea's perspective, they have to be effective, you have to engage with both.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me take a first question for Namlin. Her asks, what did the Ming try to achieve by refusing Chosun's efforts regarding the disputing slander for so long? It seems to me that the Ming had some goals of their own in intentionally refusing a quick fix, which was a very simple matter. It seems to me that the Ming needed Chosun's disputing slander in place far more than Chosun needed to solve it. And thank you for your talk.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's with these whenever we read diplomacy, not being in the room, it's hard to really get in what's unspoken. But I think this is where asymmetry actually really matters. And I think it's possible that certain Ming bureaucrats were resistant to helping Chosun on this because they had their own agenda. So, for example, someone who was might see this as, oh, this is leverage over Chosun that we should not give up. But the thing is, the Ming bureaucracy is very complex, and policy over Chosun is not something that that really gets imperial attention, except at critical moments. For example, during the Indian War, where the emperor, really cares about the outcome. But the Jiajing emperor, the Wan the emperor, they're pretty aloof from these kinds of issues. And so a lot of the decision making is happening at a lower level of aggregation. So on the one hand, you might have a Ming official who really thinks this is an opportunity to to keep as you suggest, maybe keep this in place so that Chosun can be surrounded. You may have another Ming official who's very happy to take some bribes and push this forward. But you may also have another Ming official who will think that, well, we already printed the Ming Huidian. If we're going to print it again, we need to get a budget for it. It's not easy to correct these lines. I think I disagree with that point because the Ming Huidian is a huge undertaking. You have to carve all these blocks. You print them. So to get rid of these lines, you have to change the imperially commissioned blocks. You have to carve new blocks. You have to reprint all these editions. So that's why the Ming officials who are sympathetic to Chosun say, well, we will correct this, but we'll do it when we reissue the text. And that doesn't happen until 1589 when they revise the Ming Huidian, right? So actually, I think the Ming were willing to collaborate with Chosun on this, but Chosun wanted a quicker fix that was, I think, materially difficult for the Ming court to actually pull through. And this is also accounting for these other dynamics. And why I say asymmetry matters is because the Chosun challenge is not that necessarily that there is a Ming official who is going against Chosun. It's just that Chosun is not important enough to be remembered. And the repeated missions to say, please change this, please change this. Yes, I know you agreed, but please change this, is to make sure this never gets forgotten. So when the Huidian is recarved, the Ming officials remember to do it, right? And that's why it's more important to keep the context, the discursive context and the precedents alive than it is necessarily about getting a quick fix right away, right? They're there for the long game. And I mean, we might compare this also to sort of create, diplomatic disputes over islands, sovereignty over islands that don't seem very important, but there's always an office that's just constantly repeating this, because if you don't repeat it, then it stops becoming valid and it can get lost in the shuffle. And that's not to say that, individual diplomats may have very different ideas about what's going on. But when you look at sort of something like grand strategy in the aggregate, and I think this is a conceit maybe of international relations studies, is that, we're kind of moving away from the level of what individual policymakers are thinking, but in terms of like what collectively they are shaping.
Thank you. I think this may blend into the next question. I'm not sure who wrote this. Building off of your book, how should we understand the coexistence of physical territorial borders with the cultural, ideological boundaries and sort of the imagined geography or the idealized political imaginary? In other words, when territorial sovereignty is spatially finite, but the cultural sphere is imagined as boundless, how do these frameworks shape or constrain each other? Small question.
Small question. Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's there's a lot of ways to think about it, but I think there's I think since you bring up territorial sovereignty, maybe we can think about the 21st century. There's the United States, but the United States has the ability to do things that are outside of its sovereign borders, and some people call this American empire. And then one of the things that come up is that, well, what are the legal basis for that extension of power? Like, who authorizes the United States to do that, right? And I think the deployments in the Caribbean Sea are a good example of this. But just look at 21st century history. We can also think about this question. I think it's not really so much an issue that is solved, but it's just an open question for any large state, is that where are the bounds? There can be a view of American empire that is the Wilsonian view, where American values and American ideals can really extend as far as it can, and the United States should shape the global world order as much as it can. Right, but then you can also have other views of American power. The Jacksonian view, which is maybe the one that is dominant right now, is one that says, the United States should only care about its own borders and what's within its own borders. But even with the Jacksonian view in place, we're deploying in Venezuela or in the Caribbean Sea. So I think this tension is just perpetually there. And I think the historical question is, how do particular regimes or moments or the people who are dealing with this, how do they deal with this problem of imperial power spilling out of its supposed borders, right? And I think this is a perennial question. And if you're on the receiving side, then it's a question of what do you do about it, right? And I think a middle power strategy is one that has to account for that possibility.
Thank you. So we're basically at the end of time, but I wonder if I could group two questions together. At least I think I can.
I'm happy to stay as long as GWIX has the energy for it.
Anna Weinman asks, says, thank you for the talk, and she's interested in the regional diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis North Korea. So in some sense, this and the question from Lena Ni ask you, it's not just the China-Korea relationship, but there are other regional actors engaged here. Lena Ni, for example, asks also about the Chosun military's actions on Tsushima or in conversation with Ming China suppressing Japanese pirates. So how do you understand this bilateral relationship as it engages with other regional?
Okay, so regional diplomacy with North Korea. This is not my area of specialization, so I'm kind of going off on a limb. But just thinking about the realist interests, I don't see why China would mediate this relationship, because North Korea and China's particular relationship has a different kind of mutual benefit that in a way that it doesn't sit well at all with the goals of the six-party talks. And I think Russia's position too is that. But I think here what we have is maybe a conflict between sort of an American-led idea of international order. I don't know, the Washington Consensus, the liberal world order, where where the idea is that a stable international environment is where as many parties as possible are beholden to these crisscrossing international institutions, international law, the WHO, the WTO, IMF, all these structures, right? And if you can get North Korea into these structures, and if you can show China and Russia that it's more beneficial to participate in these structures than it is to try to game it or overthrow it or create an alternative to it, then you can make something work out of the six-party talks. I think that's the premise, right? But I'm not sure neoliberalism is still around, and I don't know what happened to the Washington Consensus, right? So we're in a very different epoch, I think, historically. At least the current idea is that Russia's outside of the international order. North Korea and Russia are deepening their bilateral relationship. China is actively posing or constructing. I wouldn't say it's quite out of that order because it's still very dependent on the globalization that the neoliberal order has made possible. But China is definitely flirting with the idea of creating an alternative one, whether this is just like a banner or a slogan, or if it's something that they can actually do. I have no idea. But we're in a very different context. So the strategic objectives of these six groups are no longer aligned. I am not sure if they were really aligned in 2003 to 2008, but at least among the diplomatic communities representing these countries, there was enough alignment for them to see if this can work, right? But we're in a different age. And I think this also goes back to Lena's question, about Chosun military action, and I think like I said, I'm a new diplomatic historian, so I don't do the play-by-play, who said what to whom and why. Not that this isn't important, but it's just not how I think about these issues. But I think what emerges from these coalition wars, right, is this idea that Chosun is not invading Tsushima or the Jianzhou Jurchens or the Maoyan Urangkad as they're not doing this as I have to fight a war. They're doing this on behalf of heaven, right? So Chosun's military actions gradually, I think it becomes very clear by the late 15th century, this idea that warfare is about repairing a mutually shared world order where the Ming is on top, and that's the banner of war, right? So the joint war, Chosun is helping the Ming restore the universe, right? Rhetorically, this sounds a lot like the first Gulf War. It sounds a lot like how the West talked about the invasion of Afghanistan. Is that this is about repairing the world, right? It's getting rid of the terrorists and the rebels and the not what is it, the rogue actors, right? It's that language, right? It's a war. It's a punitive expedition against the people who are upsetting the moral world order, the pirates, the bandits, the basically the equivalent of terrorists in that period. I'm not saying any of these words, these labels should or should not be used. It's not my concern. My point is that this is the kind of politics, the kind of warfare, the kind of just war that's being advocated for. And if you've read Celeste, you must remember Mike Walter, is that the right the theory of just war?
Michael Walt.
Michael Waltz, right? Waltz, right? And in and his theory of just war is really about contractual war, like warfare as an extension of a contractual break, and that in order to have just war, both sides have to obey a set of rules of war. So it's kind of like war is just a more violent version of a court conflict, and of course, a court case or like a lawsuit in the European tradition is an extension of a feud. Right, so the feud becomes the lawsuit, and the lawsuit becomes interstate war, right? And Waltz says that the coalition wars of led by like the American led UN in the name of police action doesn't count as just war because it completely twists this, right? So he's really against that idea, right? Because he really wants to see international order in terms of contractual relations that are legally bound between free entities. But the kind of war that the kind of just war that Chosun and Ming are engaged in looks a lot like American-led coalition wars. And I think this is a structural issue. I'm not saying there's an intellectual link, but we are looking at similar kinds of phenomena, or they're in the same class. Yeah.
So before closing it out, I do want to say you were right. Walzer is the last
Also,
name. So sorry about that. You're more of a political scientist than I am. So I just want to say on behalf of all of us at GWIX and in the audience, thank you for this really thought-provoking presentation today. I think it spans centuries and many different parts of the globe. And like all of your work is very, again, thought-provoking. And I want to thank you for joining us for the first of this year's Premodern lecture series. We're going to have 3 more in the spring. For those of you in the audience who are interested in joining, please stay in touch with GWIX. But otherwise, thank you for coming today, and I hope you all have a great weekend. And thank you, Sixiang, for this presentation.
Thank you everyone for joining me here, and thank you, Professor Arrington, for the invitation.